to the G5 Hive and our next installment of our Worker Bee series, where we deep dive into the G5 college football landscape with the folks that know the teams the best. If you're watching this on YouTube, please hit that like and subscribe button. And if you're listening to us in podcast form, please rate and review. Today, we'll be heading over to the American Athletic Conference and taking a look at the UTSA Roadrunners, who finished 7-6 last season and capped off their season with a victory in the Myrtle Beach Bowl. They wrapped up their 2025 spring practice on April 26th. We have a special guest joining today. He is a UTSA beat reporter for the Express News and has never met a Haley Williams song he didn't like. He is Greg Luca. Greg can be found at Greg Luca on X. Welcome to the show, Greg.
It's a hell of an intro. I like it around here. You guys got to have me back more often. Gets me all fired up. It was nice to hear the fight song with no spring game. I haven't heard it in a while. I'm fully in the mood now. This is good.
Let's get after it, and let's start off with people who are not maybe familiar or turning into the G5 Hive for the first time. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself and how long you've been covering UTSA football?
For sure. So I started covering football for the San Antonio Express News in October 2018. And I feel like it was probably a really good time to get on the beat because I covered about a year and a half of Frank Wilson's tenure and saw some of the lows that the program went through towards the end of that run. And then I've gotten to experience everything that's gone on since Jeff Traylor took over and kind of the ascension of the program to a level where now they're probably expected to be kind of contending or one of the top G5 teams year in and year out for as long as he's around. So it's been a really interesting process for me to kind of get used to this landscape and to get to see how it's changed over my time here, it's all happened very fast.
Well, let's move over to the Roadrunners football team. And for those not familiar with the offensive style or scheme that they run, how would you describe it?
Yeah, so primarily it's a spread look. And in terms of what it'll look like for personnel, I mean, there's going to be a lot of different option elements. So they're usually going to have one back, and then it's usually it's a question of whether they're going to do one tight end or two tight ends. And I think that'll come down to personnel a lot. And it's interesting. We'll get into the groups later, but this year they have a lot of receivers and a lot of tight ends that they like. So you'll see different option elements, but generally they're going to try to spread the ball around. Probably about 50-50 run pass is what they're looking for. If they're really productive running the ball, I imagine they'd like to be able to just keep handing it off. So it ends up kind of even in yardage split if it's not more rush calls. But generally, it's a pretty balanced approach.
Well, let's get to the position where it all starts on offense, and that's the quarterback. Coming into the 2024 season, the question was, how would this team look without Frank Harris at the helm? Well, it was bumpy to start, and then it seems to start humming there against Florida Atlantic as they finished the season 5-2. Owen McCollum threw for 15 touchdowns and 8 picks during that stretch. There's even a 2-game run where he had back-to-back 4 touchdowns, 0 interception games. What are the expectations surrounding McCowan heading into year 2 as a starter?
Yeah, they're enormous, as high as it could get, I think. I mean, what we saw last year, given some of the early struggles with the offense where it felt like things just kind of weren't clicking, he was always the bright spot. He was, insofar as they were on track and competitive in some of those games that they lost early, it seemed like he was doing a lot of the heavy lifting. He was probably even more impressive with his legs and his ability to create in that way than a lot of people would have expected. And I think like any time a football team struggles, people look at the quarterback, but it was never really well-founded criticism early in the year about potentially looking a different route. He was always pretty clearly the best option that they had. And, there's times you could nitpick, did he make the right decision on an option, or did he make the right call on an RPO or something like that? There was certainly room to maybe nitpick here and there, but you saw him just get better and better at that through the year as he got more used to the offense and being in a starting role. And I mean, probably the highest praise I could give him is he just changes the math of this football team in the sense of he's probably a guy who could get 6 or 7 figures playing NIL wise for a different program and is instead here because he has such a strong connection to Jeff Traylor and their family goes back many, many years. Jeff Traylor coached his family, his dad at Jacksonville High over in East Texas. So the fact that that those connections run so deep, they get quite a discount on the most important position on the field, and it allows them to fill out the rest of their roster, and it makes it a more appealing destination for other offensive players. So when you talk about however much they're going to spend on the roster, they're getting like $1 million off because it's just the impact that he has on all these other guys.
For those not familiar with McCown's game, how would you describe it?
Yeah, I think he really he's not necessarily like a gunslinger type or somebody who's going to make a lot of things happen on his own. He really does play within the system and has a really sound kind of understanding of what they want to do and where they want to move the ball. And like I mentioned, that just got better over the course of his first season, just getting more used to the reads and things like that. And if you look back at the season in the big picture, you start to recognize that he's had some issues with keeping a lot of his primary weapons healthy and on the field. There were times where, David Amador missed a lot of time and Devin McEwen missed a lot of time, and those could have been his top two receivers, I think, if everything played out the way it was supposed to last year. And even we'll talk about DeCorian Clark later, but just like who was going to be available for him, it was not probably exactly what they expected. So he had to adjust on the fly, and I think his ability to do a little bit with his legs, probably more than people expect, just sort of looking at him and profiling him as they go through the scouting process. And then his ability to make pretty accurate throws. I don't think he has the biggest arm necessarily compared to some other guys you might talk about, but the accuracy is sort of what sets him apart. And when you're just trying to make the right reads in the spread system, that's really all you have to do.
And when you talk about, the options there at wide receiver, and what you like to see is a quarterback elevate the play of everyone else, and it seems like he definitely does that.
Yeah, for sure. I think that just his ability to keep everything on time and on schedule allows everybody to accentuate their strengths and to find where they fit in the offense, and they just have to know if they do their job, he's going to deliver for them. And there's times too where he's kind of making sure, I think any good quarterback will do this, but just kind of making sure everybody's on the same page and aligned right when they're kind of making some checks at the line, because of how intellectual he is around the game, they gave him a lot of freedom from his first start to be able to sort of make some adjustments when he sees the need to do that. So it wasn't always just wholesale changing the plays, but there was comfort with him making checks. And as the year got on, that just became more and more.
Well, Eddie Lee Marburger was the backup last season, and he's since transferred out. What does the depth behind Owen look like?
Yeah, I think Brandon Tennyson was always a guy that they seemed like they were kind of high on behind the scenes. It is very tough nowadays to figure out which backups are good and which backups aren't, because if anybody tells you the backup is good, then they think another school is going to come steal them away. So they don't tell you if the backup is good. They just keep all that on the down low. But it does seem like that he's probably most primed to be the number 2 option. But there could always be movement over the summer. I think largely we're at a point where if there's an issue with Owen McCown, it's going to probably hurt the season pretty significantly. I wouldn't think that they'd be able to survive that in terms of reaching the level that they might be capable of otherwise. But if you're asking who's the number 1 guy, or if they get in some blowout early in the season, who's going to come in, my guess would be Tennyson at this point. Although, yeah, I mean, I should mention Noah Lugo from BYU, the transfer as well. It's just hard because we haven't same thing I just said. They're not going to tell you if he's awesome, because then they think somebody else might come scoop him up. But it seems like, just based on the profile, that he could be in the mix for that as well. We haven't seen much from him yet.
Well, moving on to the running game, heading into the 2024 season, we knew about the trio of Robert Henry Jr., Kavorian Barnes, and Rocco Griffin. Fast forward to 2025, Rocco is off to UMass, Barnes is off to TCU, while Robert Henry Jr. was given another year of eligibility due to the JUCO ruling. Promising freshman Brandon High also hit the portal and recently landed at Cal. Between Barnes, Griffin, and High, the room vacates 190 rushing attempts, 767 yards, and 10 touchdowns. This room does return Will Henderson III and former Texas Tech transfer Bryson Donnell. They also added Amarian Peterson from USC, and just yesterday, John Emery Jr. from LSU. Neither of those two guys are obviously on campus during the spring. What do you think we should make of this room here heading into the 2025 season?
Yeah, it's a really interesting conversation, because last year people talked about this running backs room and the depth that it had. There's some guys you didn't even mention who kind of filled out the depth chart last year, and people thought this was like one of the most talented position groups that UTSA football had ever had at any position in any year. And it just didn't play out that way on the field. Kavorian Barnes really struggled after we'd seen him be capable of some pretty big things as sort of a workhorse, and Rocco Griffin sort of faded away. And, I think it's because with the overall offensive struggles, it wasn't like they were in a position to give all of these guys a ton of carries, but they were not super productive on a yards per carry basis anyway. And as the year went on, Robert Henry seemed like the best and most productive guy. He always felt like the defense should be least happy to see him on the field. He's just the hardest guy to tackle and to get a handle on, and just fights for every last inch. And so he seems like the kind of guy that, if they needed him to, could very comfortably do 20 to 25 carries a game. He's just that kind of a durable, grind you down type of running back. But as of yesterday, I really don't think it's going to be necessary. But we'll see. I mean, I don't want to speak too much about John Emery Jr. because, obviously this is still all news, but and more so than anything because of the coming off an ACL tear and back-to-back years. Now, it's interesting because he had the ACL tear in 2023 and was ready for the start of last season. And by all accounts, looked pretty good in that first game. He was their leading rusher against USC. He didn't start the game, but he ended up with the most carries. He had 10 rushes for 61 yards, I believe it was, and he caught a pass for another 10 to 15, whatever it might have been. So if he's able to produce at that level at LSU, and obviously he's got the pedigree. He was the number one running back in the country when he signed in 2019. So that was obviously a long time ago, and he's been through a lot of stuff since then. He missed a year to academic issues too, but he has been productive enough at that level when he's on the field that you would think that that translates to a pretty high level of production here. But he's got to be healthy, and he's got to be bought in, and he's got to fit the system and all the different things that come with that. And he's got to beat out Robert Henry, which is not totally free either. I mean, he's obviously a guy that could have transferred up to a higher level. I think probably had some offers on the table and chose to stay here. So I think my guess would be you'll see the two of them, but the other guys are interesting. I mean, Bryson Donnell put up pretty good yards per carry average, and I thought he would look effective in the opportunities he got, which is why when Brandon Hive this spring announced that he was transferring out, it's a loss for them. And he obviously would have seen some playing time, but I don't think it's irreplaceable. And then you mentioned Will Henderson. He's sort of an interesting prospect, a guy that they did just enough with him last year just to be able to preserve the red shirt. He played in 5 games, but that's because one of them was the bowl. So he has that extra year of eligibility coming back, and his speed is what really sets him apart. They knew that when they signed him, and he showed it on the field. They used him in a lot of different sort of kind of swing plays or sweep actions and things like that. He very rarely lined up as just a traditional running back, and here's your inside zone play. But he did a lot of these other things to try to get him involved in the offense, and you saw flashes of that speed. But it just remains to be seen if that translates to a larger role, or if that's kind of still what he's doing this year.
Given all the depth, I'm going to assume like we have seen in years past, it's going to be kind of a committee approach with probably Robert Henry Jr., probably the one leading the committee, so to speak.
Yeah, I think it's funny because Jeff Traylor makes fun of me for this because I always ask him about the different guys who get a shot to play because personally, if I was the coach, a lot of times I'd run a little bit of a tighter rotation than he does. Like they'll sub in like offensive linemen and stuff here and there. And it's just, I sort of believe if you put your best guys on the field the most often, you get the best results, right? But so I think that's just sort of his nature is he wants everybody to feel like they have a chance to play if they come to UTSA. It's sort of all part of a big picture recruiting pitch. And there's probably some equity in it too. The guys practice every day, and so he wants to give them all a shot. So you will certainly see that at a position like running back where that's the norm to begin with, that I would expect a lot of guys to get in the game.
All right, and I realize it's early, and you haven't seen the two recent transfers yet. But if you had to guess here, mid-May, who do you think gets the first carry against Texas A&M?
I think mostly because Jeff Traylor sort of values the loyalty and the institutional know-how aspect of it. I think it'll be Robert Henry. And if you tell me at the end of the game, Robert Henry's got 7 carries and one of the other guys has 15, I wouldn't be surprised. But I do think that they'll give Robert Henry the first nod, and then it'll just come down to who's the most productive. Peterson's interesting coming from USC. I just don't know a lot about him. He doesn't have the resume or the productivity that Emory brings, but he's also younger. So maybe that's in there too. It'll just be a matter of who kind of stands out in the fall. But I think they're in a good spot in that room. That's one of the positions I certainly wouldn't be worried about.
Let's move over to the strong, deep-looking wide receiver room. The Roadrunners, leading wide receiver in terms of yardage. Chris Carpenter graduated, as did J.J. Sparkman, and Jace Wilson is off to Sacramento State. Everyone else who caught a ball in this room in 2024 is back in 2025. What are the expectations for this group heading into the season?
It's funny because I've done this like 3 times now, but people say UTSA is losing their leading receiver, and I look at the stats and I'm like, are they really? And I guess over the course of the year, Chris Carpenter did end up as the leading receiver, but it rarely felt like he was the number one guy or the most important guy in that room in the big picture. Because I think after what we saw Devin McEwen do as a true freshman, the expectations were kind of through the roof for him last year, and he ended up being pretty productive overall, but it was limited by injury. He missed some time. I can't remember exactly what it was, but it was just something that sort of nagged him a little bit during the middle of the season, and then he had to kind of work his way back into it. And by the end of the year, he said he still wasn't 100%, but he was playing anyway. So whatever his production was, it's essentially half of a season, maybe a little bit more. So you multiply that out, and he would have been the number one guy. But David Amador is an even bigger case of that, where what he brings in terms of versatility, even in the limited snaps he played, because he had in fall camp had a hamstring injury, and usually you don't talk to the injured guys, but I don't think they expected this to be a big deal because at media day we still talked to him, and he said, I haven't been practicing because of this hamstring, but it should be good by the start of the season. And fast forward like 2 months, and he's missed more than half of the year. He missed enough time to be able to preserve a red shirt. So they were able to slowly kind of get him reintegrated. And once he did, you saw him line up at quarterback and throw a pass. You saw him line up at running back. I don't remember this play, but in the Pro Football Focus, it says he was at tight end 1 or 2 snaps, and he's just all over the field and doing all kinds of different stuff. So you saw their offense really improve once he got back into the mix, and I think it's because they did a lot of their preseason and off-season game planning around being able to utilize his versatility. It opens up certain different packages for them, and a lot of what they were doing on offense is based on the ability to move him around and decoy him and have him fill all these different roles. So once they lost that piece, it hurt them pretty heavily. So I think sort of coming into last season, we thought those were going to be their 2 most important pieces, and maybe you saw that on the field on a per game basis. Certainly Amador, his first game back, did not put up big numbers, but after that really started to click. So I see those as again, probably being the 2 most important guys, and everybody else will kind of fill in after that. But it is kind of funny to think that they lost their leading receiver because I don't think they feel like they're having to replace their top guy.
I mean, I'm looking back at the stats because you said that, and I'm like, okay, I had to double check. My apologies. Willie McCoy beat out Chris Carpenter by like 40 yards.
Oh, okay. Sure. No, you're right. I probably should have known that too. Absolutely. That's on me. But
so no, that's on me. Apparently I can't math well, but I mean, he was up there in the yardage. Well,
and he's an interesting case too, because Willie McCoy is coming back, and I should have mentioned him because obviously there's a lot of talent there. I think there was, I don't know if I should say this. There was one game where he had a few drops, and it seemed to me watching like he had a concussion, and they left him in the game anyway. I don't know if it was misevaluated or whatever. I don't want to start trouble with that, but it did seem like the game against East Carolina, he had some issues with drops, and I think that was probably something that stuck with him and what people remember about his season in a lot of ways, because you could argue it cost him that game. But there were plenty of times where he was really productive and a really effective deep threat. I think we'll see him on kick return and punt return a lot, but he's one that slips my mind pretty easily because he was not actively participating in the spring. I don't know exactly what's going on there. I'm sure he's still expected to be a huge part in the fall, but he was not working out with the guys this spring. So that's one that slips my mind too. But I would expect those will be the 3 guys. You'll probably see McEwen and McCoy out wide, and then Amador wherever he wants to be on that given play.
Yeah, McCoy, 27 receptions, averaging 19.8 yards per game. So yeah, you could see how he got the yardage, but maybe not the receptions, and how that goes about. But I want to ask you, Greg, did anyone else stand out to you in the spring that you were able to notice?
From the receivers group, it's hard to say, really. I mean, I think you sort of noticed those top guys more than anything because it was actually a change to have them out there and get involved. I do think one interesting note to talk about with this group is there were some other guys who weren't working out. DJ Allen is also kind of coming back from an ACL injury, and I think he showed some flashes last year. He's a TCU transfer who had his moments to shine as well. And then we're still looking at DeCorian Clark and kind of what the path is for him. For people who haven't followed his story, he had an ACL tear. I guess it was like 3 years ago now. And then they kind of thought he would be back 2 seasons ago, and it ended up there were some complications and they couldn't really get him involved. And then this season they finally had him back on the field, and he made his first reception and got hit in the knee, the opposite knee, and it's another ACL tear for him. So I think there was some questions about whether he would even try to come back or if it might be time to kind of move on from football, but he's still sort of intending to pursue an opportunity to play. And, before he got hurt the first time, we were talking about him as like a potential second or third round draft pick. Like he had shown with his size and speed combination and his athleticism and how much he had developed over his time here that he really had that potential. And now he's probably a little bit older and probably wouldn't, even no matter what he does, probably won't get evaluated in the same way, but still has a shot at a pro career if he can get back to the level he's at, which is a huge ask with the amount of injuries he's been through. But I think that's somebody that'll be easy for everybody to root for and to hope that he has that opportunity to return. It's impossible to say what he'll look like and what impact he can make on the offense, but that's certainly like an X factor that's worth monitoring.
And to elaborate, I guess, a little bit on that is, when he had that first ACL injury, it's like, hey, he's going to be out for at least 10 months. And then that kind of put us in that September time frame. And that game that you're talking about, he returned to game action. It was late September against East Carolina. Then they had a bye, and then he didn't play that following game in Rice, but then did play at FAU. Was it the FAU game then that's when that happened? Yep,
it was. I can still picture it because it was such like a jarring moment for people who had followed us, because he's a wonderful kid. Like he's one that I feel bad saying that. That's such coach speak. But like he, as come from a place where, he really had to work to learn the playbook and things like that. He admits that kind of stuff was a struggle, but has just kind of been so diligent and approached everything the right way, as far as we can tell, and as far as everybody says about him, that you really want to see him have his moment. And so it was great to see him come over just a little slant pattern over the middle, right about midfield. And it was just the defender's helmet hit him right in the knee, and you could tell it just kind of bent wrong. And he got up and tried to walk it off, and it was real wobbly. And you kind of know just from the instability what that looks like. And so, yeah, I mean, when he first had the injury in 22, he was on pace for, a kind of a record-setting season at UTSA. And so we were talking coming into 23, we talked to him about, what's your path back? And he was hoping he'd be able to get on the field. And there were games he would warm up and kind of look like he might get out there. There was, I think, a couple times he played a snap or two as a decoy. It might not have even made it to the Pro Football Focus. If I remember, they might have missed it. We were talking about the, 1 or 2 goal line plays where he'd be in there as a fade. And then so 24 coming back last year was, they had to redo the surgery and kind of go through the process again. And, was just same way, kind of slowly working his way back into different packages. And they finally felt like, okay, we can put him in there. And it was telling that it wasn't just a goal line situation, because they thought, where he doesn't have to do as much, like just a fade pattern would be an easy way to get him involved, because there's not as much kind of cutting and lateral motion sort of thing. So they were sort of doing what he was more comfortable with in that sense. But for them to put him in just in the normal flow of the offense, they must have felt pretty good about where he was at. And then, of course, to have that happen right away was pretty heart-wrenching for a lot of people. So again, like I said, this one we'll all be rooting for this fall.
So you talked about the 3 wide receivers that you think that we'll see out there in Amador, McEwen, and McCoy. Who do you think will step up and be the leading wide receiver for this offense in 2025?
I think I would have to go with McEwen, just because it's gonna be McEwen or Amador, I would think, based on what we saw at the end of last year. And I just feel like McEwen is the more prototypical number one. It's kind of an interesting story because he's also from East Texas, so him and Owen McCown have been kind of doing summer workouts together for a very long time. So they have a pretty deep connection too that kind of surpasses what Owen and David Amador have started to build. And just because Amador is going to get used in so many different ways, I think maybe he'll have fewer opportunities at just straight up targets especially from out wide, the way McEwen will be. So I think Devin McEwen's primed for a huge season.
Moving over to the tight ends, if you were to describe how the tight ends are utilized in this offense to someone that's never caught a UTSA game, how would you describe it?
Yeah, it's interesting how they use all their different guys, because I talked about the way they're spread elements, but sometimes they'll line up with 5 wide, but it's still like 11 or 12 personnel. So they'll have a running back out there, or they'll have a tight end or 2 out there split out wide, and then they'll move those guys. Very rarely are you going to see them line up in some kind of like power formation and have the quarterback under center and do some inline blocking as tight ends. Those guys, and you look at the type of players they have too, they're all, we're going to talk about Oscar Cardenas moving on. The guys who are behind him are more kind of lanky, slimmer. Not that they don't have good size on them, but they're like the guys you envision as more
They're big wide receivers.
Right, essentially. Yeah, right. That's the right way to say it. So, Houston Thomas and Dan Dishman and Patrick Overmeyer, there's guys, they're the type of guys, like I was talking about earlier, the guys they want to keep under wraps and make sure nobody sees what they can do. But I do think that at some point they intend to like fully unleash them as these potentially top weapons in the offense. I don't know if we'll ever see them as the leading receivers, maybe beyond a week-to-week basis, but certainly there's a lot of belief in the talent that those guys bring.
Well, as you mentioned, the man, the myth, the legend, Oscar Cardenas graduated, but this room is very strong with the return of the team's 3rd leading receiver in Houston Thomas. They also return Patrick Overmeyer and Dan Dishman. Did any of those guys kind of stand out to you this spring?
I think certainly Houston Thomas and Patrick Overmeyer bring a lot of the same things to the table. They're all like in that big receiver mold and that catch radius that they allow Owen to kind of make some mistakes if he ever does, and to deliver with tough catches. And we've seen them be able to stretch the field a little bit down the middle, and we've seen them be able to do some of the things that tight ends typically do in a little bit closer range. So I think both of those guys are big weapons. Dishman's been around for a while and brings some of the same things to the table, but I think he's maybe a little bit less dynamic of an athlete. So Houston Thomas and Patrick Overmeyer are the 2 to watch. And, as you mentioned, just looking at last year, Houston's kind of had the leg up on him for the time being, but I think they're kind of interchangeable. I think you might see them play pretty even snaps this year.
Yeah, to that point, it almost seemed like, Houston kind of broke out a little bit earlier, had his stretch, and then kind of Patrick had his stretch in there as well. I'm guessing you kind of expect that to continue where, it kind of might be, the hot hand, so to speak.
Yeah, it could be game to game and week to week, and then it'll also be, I mean, somebody's going to twist an ankle or whatever, right? I think that was probably the case last year too, where it was just whoever was healthier at that moment, especially at a little bit more of a physical position like that. Like I said, they're not lining up and running it downhill every play, but they're still getting involved in some physicality. So it's a lot of it will come down as well to who's the healthiest, because I think really they don't see them as being too much different in terms of what they bring to the offense.
Well, a majority of this offensive line returns in 2025. Honestly, once left guard Ben Rios got into the starting lineup, this team really started to gel. Now that I did say a majority of this line is returning, who isn't returning? That would be center CJ James Jr. The staff also brought in 3 transfers to bolster this room. What are the expectations for this room heading into 2025?
Yeah, it's interesting. Depending on who you talk to, and CJ James did a good job at center. I think he maybe started a little bit slow, but then sort of got his feet wet in the system and started to really thrive as the year went on and ended up getting an NFL camp look. But depending who you talk to, there's some idea that maybe they were going to push him out to tackle and have either Rios or Luke Lopez play center last year. So they were already sort of planning around some different possibilities at center. So Luke Lopez ended up missing the whole year due to injury, so I wouldn't be super surprised if he ended up being that guy. But Ben Rios has been working at center a lot too. So I think it'll be one of those two guys stepping in for CJ. And then the idea that they can keep the rest of the offensive line intact is something they feel pretty good about. Not all those guys worked out this spring, so there were some opportunities for some other guys to get reps. But I think when push comes to shove in the fall, I think you'll probably see the same group as last year line up out there, and then they're just going to hope that the guys who got a little bit of spring work are going to be a little bit more ready if they need to get called on.
So I mentioned, Ben Rios once he got in there, and he was at left guard. So if he's going to go over to center, who's then going to go to left guard?
Yeah, I think it looks like Venli Tatafu will be the left guard. And he's been, ever since he came over from JUCO, he's been kind of a guy who kind of fit in wherever they needed him. He played some tackle, even though that's not really a strength for him. And every year it was a question of is this going to be the year he goes back to guard, or is he going to end up at tackle? And then they usually ended up having to use him at tackle because of injuries or whatever the case may be. But I think when they build the depth chart through the spring and they sort of project what it looks like in the fall, if everybody's healthy, they probably believe that left guard is his best and most natural spot. So I think that's most likely where you will see him line up.
So like I mentioned, there's a lot of guys coming back, but their line's going to have their hands full week 1 against Texas A&M. Who does this room look to as the leader of the offensive line?
Yeah, it's a pretty good question. I always think of, usually you think of the center, and I think last year it was CJ James. But this year, given that there's some newness at that position potentially, Corey Godinet at right guard is one of the guys that they voted into sort of their leadership group last year, but he doesn't talk much. We've actually never spoken to him in the media. I think he just doesn't want to be that guy. So he leads in a different kind of way, which is not necessarily wrong, but I don't know if he's the guy that they're going to look to for that or not. In terms of more vocally, we talked to Kamar Missouri a lot. He's the left tackle he transferred in from Rutgers last year, and similar to CJ, I think maybe he had some early bumps in the road, and there were some times where he was pretty clearly playing hurt, but there were other times where he looked pretty outstanding, and I think they'll be really happy to have him back at left tackle, so he could easily be that guy. And I think Venli's probably more in the mold of Corey Godinet, where he doesn't seem like as much of a talker and that really on-field leader, vocal kind of guy. But maybe they just value that kind of stability and his time in the program and his willingness to do whatever they need to do to deliver at a high level. So it's sort of anybody's guess at this point. But I have my money on the guy who's kind of breaking the huddle would be Kamar Missouri.
All right, Greg, if you had to pick an offensive player to have a breakout type season in 2025, who would that be?
It's pretty tough because they're all somewhat familiar, but it's pretty easy to say I can go with Amador just because he hasn't been able to show it for a full season yet. I think once you see what he can do with the offense tailored to his strengths and the ways that they intend to utilize him, which can only expand from last year. I mean, they've just had more time to kind of work more stuff in the spring and potentially get different gadget plays that they feel comfortable with through the summer and whatnot as well. I think you could see him put up some kind of crazy stat line where he's got, close to 1,000 yards receiving, but then he might also have some 100 rushing and 100 passing or something weird like that. 100 passing is probably a big ask. They might not do that more than 2 or 3 times in a season, but I could see some kind of weird stat line like that where we're looking through the archives trying to see if it's ever happened before. So he's the guy that I would put my money on.
Well, let's move over to the defensive side of the ball. And for those not familiar with UTSA's defensive scheme, how would you describe it?
Yeah, so they They probably primarily run a 3-down. That's how they're going to draw it up on the depth chart. And then they have their will linebacker is basically like the primary pass rusher, edge rusher guy. They play 2 inside linebackers, and they play they call it a money backer, which it cuts me to my core. I don't know what that is or why we have to call it that, but I think it's most like a nickel position, but it also does some pass rushing, and they play against the run too. It's usually kind of like think of like a linebacker's mentality in a defensive back's body. It's like a guy who maybe doesn't have the same comfort and skill level playing in the open field and is more comfortable around the box, but can also run with a faster tight end or even a slot receiver if needed. So that's a guy that'll play around the line of scrimmage a lot and probably be leaned on to make a bunch of different plays. It's going to be Owen Pee Wee because it was his job last year as well. So that's sort of how they shape out up front. And then the secondary is a secondary, 2 corners, 2 safeties. So.
Well, let's move over to the position groups that are going to run this defense. And while the offense has a lot of the same faces in 2025, the defense, that's a whole nother story. Let's start up front with the guys along that defensive line. By the way of graduation or the portal, the group sees their top 4 linemen in terms of snaps apart from this room. None bigger than edge outside linebacker, first-team all-conference Jamari Robinson. He generated an eye-popping 48 pressures and had 9 sacks in 2024. Looking at the 2025 team, looks to be highlighted by the return of the duo of Vic Shaw off the edge and John Jones on the interior. Those 2 combined for 22 pressures and 5 sacks. Given the losses in this room, what should be the expectations for this defensive line in 2025?
Yeah, that edge position is probably the most interesting spot on the team, and I think a lot of it will determine how strong or weak they are as a unit. Because 2 years ago it was Trey Moore's job, and he went to Texas after winning Conference Defensive Player of the Year for UTSA and the American. And then obviously last year, you just mentioned Jamari Robinson. He was the Conference Player of the Year at that edge position. So pretty big shoes for Vic Shaw to kind of come in to fill now that Jamari is transferred to West Virginia. And I guess the saving grace, we're always doing this running tally of like how many guys has X program lost to the transfer portal that because of NIL or whatever the case may be. And I sort of, and not just for UTSA, but for all these teams, we'll try to give them a pass for these JUCO guys who had the extra year where they didn't expect it. And we're going to talk about Martavius French, who went to Colorado, and we're going to talk about Jamori, obviously, who went to West Virginia. They were both kind of played the season thinking it was their last year at UTSA and probably found whatever closure they needed. So I don't hold it against sort of the esteem of the program as much that they're not sticking around for that extra season here and have chosen to pursue that somewhere else. But in the big picture, it does sort of leave this opening for Vic Shaw to fill, and it seems like he is far and away the number 1 guy for that spot. He seems confident in his ability to kind of step up and take on that role. We saw him do it in the bowl game, and he came away with a sack because Jamori had already sort of opted out of that one, thinking he was going to the NFL draft. And behind him, it'll be Cam Cooper, who's kind of an interesting story. He went tight end to inside linebacker to outside linebacker, and now he's in this pass rushing role. And probably showed better flashes than you would expect for somebody moving around that much who wasn't necessarily profiled to that position to begin with. But to say he'll be able to produce at a level similar to what the production he has to replace is a big ask. So a lot of it will fall on the shoulders of Vic Shaw to see what he can do to keep that train going. And then on the defensive line part, those 3 interior guys, they've always talked about their mottos, everybody eats, because they've usually been 3 deep at all 3 spots. And this year, maybe the depth is not the same way, but maybe we'll find out that it is. And I think John Jones is a good guy to start with. I mean, he came in here late, kind of a weird situation coming up from the FCS, and sort of looked pretty comfortable pretty early on, learned the defense relatively quickly, and looked like he was ready to be a contributor in that room. And I would expect that to just keep rolling. And then opposite him, you have Ty Leonard, who I would project him right now as the other starter at defensive end. He's kind of an interesting case because he was conference all freshman team. That's the words I'm looking for when he was first here. And that's always sort of interesting because you don't always necessarily play a lot of guys along the line of scrimmage. So that's not always the highest bar to clear. It's like if you're on the field, you're able to get that. But he was pretty productive in the time that he had as a freshman. And so that sort of set some expectations for him. And last year, he ended up not being able to show entirely what he could do because of injury. He ended up preserving a red shirt and only playing in 4 games. So there's sort of a process now of being able to step up and potentially having more snaps available in terms of the rotation that they had previously, and how he sort of had to wait and fight for playing time. And then there's some interesting guys behind him. I mean, Damian Wimberly is a transfer who there's times where I watch him in practice and I think he might be an outside linebacker. Like he's kind of a lean, athletic guy coming in as a transfer from SMU. And I think it'll be interesting to see what he does as a pass rusher. I don't know if they intend to use him more in passing situations or whatever the case may be, or if they'll just, maybe he's a more well-rounded player than I profile him as, and he'll just be out there a lot. And potentially the most impactful transfer they got this year could be Kyan Roberts-Day coming in here from Baylor, I believe. I don't know why I'm blanking right now, but he's a defensive end as well who could be pretty big in that rotation. And they have two kind of experienced guys in the middle who we've seen a little bit from in Jamie and Buxton and Chad Otutu. So I think they should be able to hold down that nose tackle spot pretty well.
That outside linebacker / edge position with the going from Jamori to over to Vic, do you see them, like, their skill sets being similar enough that they're going to kind of be used the same way, or do you think perhaps maybe it'll be a little bit different because their skill sets are just a little bit different?
Yeah, I feel like every year, just because that position's been so disruptive, I end up asking some version of like, do you have to scheme up more pressure rather than just letting that guy go do his thing? And every year the guy that steps in is just as good as the guy before. So I don't think that they intend to change the scheme too much to try to give him some help or bring pressure from different areas. I mean, you asked about the scheme before. They already do probably more corner blitzes than I see from the average team. They you don't see a lot of safeties, but they like to bring that guy off the edge and kind of come from some different looks sometimes. So I think you'll probably see a normal amount of that. And generally, I think they're just going to count on Vic Shaw to see what he can do, kind of stepping into the same kind of role that Jamori and Trey played before him. So it'll just be a matter of how productive he's going to be. And it's just hard to say. We haven't seen a ton of him. And I could say he doesn't have the recruiting profile of those guys, but those guys didn't have that either. I mean, Trey Moore was pretty unrecruited and Jamori was a JUCO guy. So it's not like they came in here with huge expectations and sort of lived up to it. But before I forget, there is another guy to look for off the edge is Nana Anyanwu, who came in as a JUCO transfer 2 years ago and has not really been able to see the field. He also had kind of back-to-back years get sidelined by season-ending injuries very early in the season. So presuming he's healthy and hasn't lost anything from going through that process, he's a guy that was expected to contribute when he got here, and I don't see why that would be any different if he can finally get on the field this year.
Given the opportunity available in this room, who do you feel is most ready to kind of make that jump in 2025 and take advantage of it?
Yeah, you know what? I'm glad you gave me one more question because I forgot a very important guy. They have Johnny Bowens in the mix on the defensive line as well, and I like I said before, he didn't do a lot of spring workouts. He was just sort of out there kind of rehabbing, but he's a guy who was played here locally. He's a San Antonio area guy and built a pretty big recruiting profile, big enough that he ended up going to Oregon and now transferred back, and I think could have made an impact last year, but ended up getting injured very early on and not able to show what he could do on the field. So he could end up being the best guy in that defensive line unit and could end up, even though he's more of a down guy, heavier set lad, I think could end up being a lot of that pass rushing presence that you're looking for too. So I would expect him to contribute in a major way, provided that he's fully healthy and ready to go.
Like the defensive line, the linebacking group took some hits in terms of snaps. They lost their top three linebackers. You got Jamal Ligon and Brevin Randall. They've graduated. Martavius French, like you mentioned earlier, is off to Colorado. This room's highlighted by the return of former four-star recruit Kendrick Blackshire, who played in a reserves role in 2025. But this room seems to lack a lot of that game experience that you're looking for. How did this linebacking group look in the spring?
Yeah, Kendrick Blackshire is a really fascinating guy to keep an eye on because just the pedigree in recruiting and having come from Alabama, I think there were some high levels of expectations for him last year, at least on terms of his potential. And you see him in practice, it's like, who is that guy? Like, he is a monster-looking man. And it didn't translate to the field necessarily in the same way. I think he ended up, like, the standout moment is getting flagged for a late hit. And I think there was one or two sort of boneheaded issues like that popped up, and we just didn't end up seeing him play a lot or be very productive. I don't know how many tackles he ended up with for the season, but it was not some huge number. And so, he potentially obviously has the build and the talent to take a huge step forward, and I think he will be asked to, because as of right now, he's got a pretty clear path to a starting spot in that room. The other one that stands out is TCU transfer Shad Banks, who is, a lot of times when you see the guys transfer from the power conference level, it's guys who were not very productive, or they're coming off injuries, or they're bounce backs who are local, or whatever the case may be. But he had a pretty productive run at TCU, and for whatever reason has ended up, maybe I think it was sort of later in his career, had sort of taken a little bit more of a backseat, but is now sort of able to potentially embrace a much bigger role here. And I think he's the one guy I would say is sort of a shoo-in as a starter. they've talked a lot about Brandon Tucker, transfer coming in from East Texas A&M, formerly Commerce, and Ian Jackson is another guy who transferred in from Alabama alongside Blackshire and didn't necessarily show a lot last year, but might be in a position where he needs to. Although, the way the game works today, they could always bring in somebody. But that right now, that's a position that seems like it's kind of up for grabs, and a lot of those guys who were in reserve roles last year are just kind of in line to be able to fight for the spot.
Well, I had to look it up. Blackshire, 3 tackles last season. So who do you think is going to replace Liggins and French's role here in 2025?
I think you got to look at Chad Banks as being that guy, because they were in a rare position last year with those guys where, Jamal Liggins started here for 5 years, which is, the COVID only kind of thing. You won't see that again. And he's got a tackles record that'll probably never be broken. And he wasn't always the most vocal guy either, but as his career went on, he got more and more into that kind of a role. And he was always looked at as a leader for different ways too. And he just kind of made it that I think actually last year, maybe his production was a little bit lesser, but he made more plays that sort of jumped off the screen when you're just sort of watching him down to down. And that was the case the year before too, where, maybe not the highest raw tackle numbers, but was really impactful on the defense. And he's a guy that you just kind of always knew that he was going to be in the right spot because he had so much experience under his belt. And I think the closest you have to that this year is Chad Banks. I expect that he's going to, and it could end up being kind of a safety or a guy in the secondary who sort of is getting everybody aligned right, or like Owen Pee-wee seems like a guy who would be able to take on that role, given that he's kind of in that nickel spot. But if you're asking me who's going to be probably like the leading tackler and the guy who is counted on to stop the inside run, I think Chad Banks will be a guy who ends up getting looked at to be that reliable presence, just because he's got the experience on a big time level.
All right, let's move over to the defensive backs. And just like every other room on the defensive side, they're going to look different here in 2025. 6 of the top 8 guys in terms of snaps in this room have either graduated or hit the portal. This backfield is highlighted by the return of Jamarius Lewis, who had 2 pass breakups and 3 passes defended for this room just a year ago. This room will also see guys like Tyan Milton, Davin Martin, Elijah Newell, and Jimmy Wyrick return in 2025. It seems to have some experience at cornerback and safety, but I'm kind of curious, how do you view this secondary heading into the 2025 season?
Yeah, I'm surprised we haven't seen it yet, but if there is one position that I would expect they would add a guy to potentially just come in and start right away, it would be corner. And I think that they just, they lost probably their top 4 from last year. And even then they're just kind of were looking to replace those guys coming into the season too. So that is a position that's been very unstable lately. And, to see that Zach Morris is kind of in line for a starting role after just being sort of in a reserve spot last year. And he looked, okay in the moments that he played coming in as a transfer from New Mexico. And Davin Martin has been sort of a developmental guy who's been in the system for a little bit and potentially is ready to take on a bigger role and be a starter this season if it comes down to it. And like Jacavian Rogers is in the mix too, and he's an interesting one because we were talking about him a year or two ago coming in because he weighed like 140 pounds or whatever. Like he came in here just as a guy who was clearly a prospect and was going to need some time before he would be ready to see the field. So, I think they had Anthony Pinnis in here, and it's hard to say what role he would have played, but given that he ended up transferring to Michigan State, somebody thinks pretty highly of him to recruit him to that level. So it's safe to say that he might have been in the mix too, but that just gives them one more sort of opening on the roster of a chance to potentially go get a guy or find somebody who can plug and play and be a starter right away. So I just think it'll be really interesting to see how that position plays out. Safety is maybe a little bit more stable. Obviously, I have to replace the guys, but I think they sort of know who's in the mix there because Jimmy Wyrick was in the mix before he ended up getting injured last year, Stanford transfer, and I think he'll play a big role. And when one of the other starters got hurt, they had Ken Robinson and Elliott Davison starting the year, and when they had an opening, Jamarius Lewis stepped up, transfer as well from New Mexico, and he looked like a pretty solid option back there. So I would expect that those two will be the guys to start the year, and then Cam Upshaw from Memphis comes in with a pretty decent resume. You would think he would be a guy who would have a shot to crack that rotation, but don't think he necessarily stood out on the field in a big way in his first kind of glimpses in UTSA and might still have to work for that spot to potentially be in the rotation there. Elijah Newell showed pretty well in his very, very limited action as a freshman, and I think they probably like his promise, but it's too early to project him for a starting role. And Ty Milton's an interesting one because I don't know what it says about him as a player that they have a huge need at corner and they moved him from corner to safety. I think they just kind of figured he wasn't the answer there, and he didn't look great in the moments that he had last year, but potentially at safety could find a little bit more of a home, and maybe they did it just because they think he's that much better there and could end up being a rotational player here. So they have at least a guy who's played here to potentially look at that spot as well. So I think corner is the one where you really got to look at and see who they might end up going to get, who could end up being a starter, because again, the guys who are there now, maybe they end up being better than expected, or one of them kind of continues to develop in a way that makes them a very reliable starter. But I wouldn't be surprised if they were looking to add not just one, but two guys into that room before the season starts to potentially be ready to fill in.
Well, speaking of corner, they'll be looking to replace first team all conference cornerback Zav Frazier. Actually, I think he was our conference our AAC Conference Defensive Player of the Year last year for G5 Hive. But he's off to the Chicago Bears, drafted in the 5th round. Whether it be a cornerback or a safety, is there someone in this room that you kind of see maybe taking a step up and becoming that playmaker like Frazier was a year ago?
Yeah, I don't know if it's necessarily from a playmaking perspective. I mean, he brings kind of in the mold of Tariq Woolen before him, kind of brings a pretty unique profile just with the size and the athleticism and the way he developed into that kind of a player later in his career, coming into the draft, and then he ended up getting drafted despite being a little bit older. They're kind of eerily similar to be guys who come from the same school. And I don't know if they have anybody who necessarily fits that mold or has that kind of upside, but I do think just from a leadership perspective and the just blanket productivity you're needing, I think really both Jamarius Lewis and Jimmy Wyrick have the personalities, the maturity, and kind of the know-how to be a stabilizing force back there given the kind of uncertainty at corner, especially. Like, that those guys are kind of going to be where they need to be, and they're going to help keep the other guys lined up potentially if there's even a scenario where it's guys who might have less experience. Those two kind of know what they're doing in the system even at this early stage and are already kind of onto a leadership capacity. So I think that's going to be a big thing to look for in the back end, is those two at safety sort of keeping everything else on the rails.
All right, Greg, if you have to pick a defensive player to have a breakout type season in 2025, who you got?
The easy answer is Vic Shaw because he's going to have the most opportunity. But I actually think, just from a productivity standpoint, I do think it'll be Johnny Bowens. I think you'll see him be healthy and be ready to contribute on the defensive line in ways that really change the game, whether it's just what he does with pressure or what he does against the run. I think just from a raw talent perspective, presuming he is healthy and back up to full speed, I think he's a guy who will make a huge impact and be somebody we're talking about pretty significantly by the end of the year.
Well, let's move over to the special teams. How did those units look this spring, and are there any concerns?
Yeah, it was interesting. The coaches are so dramatic nowadays when it comes to the poaching and the transfer portal and stuff. But for UTSA, the guy who, that kind of got this year was the kicker. And I think if your big loss in the spring is the kicker, you're probably doing all right compared to a lot of other programs. But it is going to be something that they have to address, because I know they just brought in a transfer, and I don't know much about him or about the guy who was behind Tate on the depth chart, because they came into last year with Chase Allen and Tate Sandell, and then Chase Allen really struggled, and Tate Sandell was kind of a revelation with how well he played. I don't think they had any expectations that he was going to be ready to produce at that level. He had been kind of like a kickoff specialist just because he had a big leg and they wanted to preserve Chase. So they have to figure out the answer there, whether it's a guy who's on the roster or a guy who's not on the roster yet. That is something that they have to do, because Tate Sandell ended up hopping in the portal and going to Oklahoma. So I don't know. I don't want to accuse anybody of anything, but it's a little fishy. So that's just kind of how things work nowadays. But that does leave them an opening that they have to fill.
Now that the spring practice is over, which position group or groups do you think is the most concerning heading into the 2025 season?
Yeah, I think easily, just not to repeat myself, but easily corner. I know we just covered it. It'd be easier if it was something earlier in the show, but those guys, they just haven't done it at this level. And there's just not a huge number of them. You get through the list of guys who are on scholarship pretty quickly. So I don't know, maybe they just have more confidence in the guys that they've been developing than what we would guess, or that they've let on. But it does seem like that was an area they wanted to address. And we've seen a lot of transfers come in the last couple of weeks. And I know they brought in RJ Lester. Maybe they think he's going to be able to contribute right away from Oklahoma State. But aside from that, I would think you'd still want to see even one or two more guys added to that group, just given that they lost Pennis as well, on top of already having a need coming into the spring. So it'll be really interesting to see how they address that unit going forward. But I think that's the one to watch. If there's going to be a big weakness on this team, that would be what I would guess it would be.
In today's age of NIL, revenue sharing, and the transfer portal, how have you seen it change UTSA's recruiting philosophy?
Yeah, I think it's a really good way to phrase the question, because I think that philosophically it has been sort of a shift in how they approach it. And we've seen some schools where they want to lean really, really heavily on the transfer portal. I think UTSA still wants to have a balance where they're bringing in a good amount of high school guys, but I do think there's a level of frustration, let's call it, with even just the concept of identifying an under-recruited guy out of high school and bringing him in and bringing him along and developing him, and then somebody else takes him away. Like, you put in all the work and then somebody else gets to reap the benefit of it once that guy's ready to contribute. So I think they probably spend less time and effort, like even looking for those guys or trying to find those guys, versus maybe some things that they feel more confident in, less developmental guys who as freshmen might be ready to contribute, and then filling needs through the portal where it's a guy who you kind of have already seen what he can do at the college level and what he is on the field, and you can sort of plug and play and know what you're getting. So I still wonder, they are reaping the benefit right now of guys like McCown and McEwen, and obviously those are personal connections that have kept them here. But I still like to believe that there is some level of value in finding guys who value loyalty, getting in on the ground floor of some prospect who might be unrecruited and has the potential to contribute. And I mean, it's an easy example because it's right down the road. But UIW got 2 years out of Cam Ward. It just became the number one pick in the NFL draft because he had the opportunity to leave after his first season, and he said, "This is the only coach that recruited me, and so I'm going to stay here because." And that was the first year of the transfer portal. NIL and revenue sharing and all that stuff obviously isn't what it is now. It might have been much harder for him to do that. But he still stayed here an extra year when it was the NIL era already, and he could have gone somewhere else and got more money. And I don't know what his long-term plan would have been, but initially he only left because that coach, Eric Morris, went to Washington State, and he followed him to Washington State. So I think there's got to be some humans out there who still really value loyalty. And even if you are getting a guy and you develop him and he becomes a solid starter and then leaves, at least you got a year out of a solid starter. Like, sometimes I worry that people are overlooking that process too much, that there's some diamonds in the rough who are going unfound because people, like, I don't want to use the word lazy, but there's just the risk reward is no longer there from the potential to lose a guy rather than get 4 years out of him. And I think maybe there's some missed opportunities to come with that, but that's just that easy for me to say. I don't have to do the recruiting and the developing. So
I don't remember exactly what our question was last year, but it had something to do with, the NIL landscape of things. And you had talked about how they had pivoted and they were going to have an indoor practice facility. And they were like, well, we can't put our money towards that right now because we want to try to get into the NIL. Like, how has that progressed over the year?
Yeah, they still have I think it was since we last talked, they put out kind of a 5-year facilities plan, and they broke ground on a new training facility for basketball and volleyball, but the football practice facility is still on the list somewhere. I think it would have to take a donor to come say, hey, build this, because I think if you ask Jeff Traylor, you can have $2 million. What do you want to spend it on? It's going to be on revenue sharing for the players, because you'd rather have them practice in the heat than have worse players practice inside. You know what I mean? Like, that's just kind of how it works. So I think it's probably easier to win games when you have the talent that you're able to bring in. And so I do think that that's probably the priority, but it's just a question of if that's even a decision, if that money is out there to be spent. So, the American, I don't know how many guys from the American you've already interviewed or if they've talked about this before, but the American Athletic Conference has put out a rule that teams have to spend 10 million, up to 10 or minimum of 10 million over the next 3 years on whether it's revenue sharing or new scholarships or things like that related to the House settlement. So there is sort of a baseline that everybody's going to be around, and the concern among UTSA fans and probably even some coaches and administrators is that your Memphises and your USFs and all that are going to spend way more. But I mean, it just kind of is what it is. Like, there's a couple of programs out there who might have more resources than you. I think UTSA is still pretty well positioned in the league as a whole, especially because, like I mentioned at the top, like, they're kind of getting a discount with McCown. Like, whatever you would have had to spend to build this roster in theory, you have to spend a lot less on it in practice with the way it's actually played out. So I think in the whole era, when you look at the list of guys they've lost, you lost your Trey Moore, you lost your Zachary Franklin, but there's a lot of programs who can make a lot longer list of guys that they've lost. This year, it's really just Ronald Triplett, who had never even really started for UTSA. Like, he would have been a rotational piece on the defensive line again, and probably have started the way the roster shakes out this year, but it is not as catastrophic a loss as those other two guys that I mentioned. And then you're talking about French and Jamori, which I just still think because of the way that whole process played out with the JUCO waiver, I don't hold that against the program in the same way. I think those guys kind of have like a new lease on life. And I think you saw a lot of people in that position with the extra JUCO year choose to take it somewhere else just because they've graduated or wrapped up their academic track or found closure at their previous school. It makes a lot of sense to look for a new opportunity.
Well, how do you feel that the staff at UTSA is doing navigating the portal?
I think that they've really leaned on whether it's because maybe it's regionally, maybe it's guys like East Texas guys like McEwen and McCown, like I talked about. But I think that they have been able to, if a guy comes in and says he's been offered X and they can pay half X at UTSA, that's good enough, because I think that the people value the experience here and the culture and being a part of what this team has built and the success that they've had, if that makes sense. So it feels like they are able to, and this was kind of always the motto, but like, we're not going to be able to offer the most than anybody else is, but can we do enough to have everything else have some level of value that sort of evens it out where it's a tough decision for kids. And I think that that's why you have seen fewer people leave this place than a lot of other programs where, like even Tulane, who is sort of aspirational in a sense of it's viewed that they probably have more in their coffers than what UTSA does. They had lost their quarterback in a, highly publicized move. So that's the sort of thing where, UTSA has lost one or two of their most important guys over the years. But if you're making a real checklist of how many guys have they lost to the transfer portal, especially versus what they've gained, I mean, they've gotten some pretty valuable players out of the portal too. Like one of the guys they lost last year, cornerback Cam Alexander, he ended up transferring to Oregon. And, he came here from Sam Houston. So it's like, yeah, you lost him, but you also got him in the first place. So I do think their kind of ledger as far as the transfer portal goes still is more in their favor in terms of what they've gotten out of it versus what they've lost to it, which at the G5 level, you probably don't hear that a lot.
What do you think the main strength of this 2025 Roadrunners team will be?
Yeah, I think it's the opposite story from last year. This year, you have to imagine the offense should be able to hum at a pretty high level right out of the gate just because of the continuity. And last year, it was that the defense was expected to be at that level and maybe didn't, I don't want to say underperform. That's probably a little bit harsh, but I don't think that they sort of carried the team the way that they needed to while the offense kind of found its footing. And so I think this year it's kind of the opposite scenario where while we figure out who these guys are going to be on defense, we're expecting that our offense is going to be the one that's carrying us through these games and kind of putting up points as the defense sort of figures out what they're doing. So that's sort of the coach's perspective on that. And I think that that's probably justified. I believe that between Owen McCown and the receivers and the running backs that they have and the continuity on the offensive line and the tight ends, I think it's fair for them to have that perspective and think that they could probably carry the load early in the season.
All right, so based on this strength that you just talked about, and I haven't gone through all of the G5 teams yet, but I would venture to say that UTSA is at least in the top 10, maybe top 5 in returning production from 2024. What does success look like for the Roadrunners in 2025?
It's a really fascinating question because last year they were not shy about believing that they could get that playoff spot as the top G5 team. And that went out the window really quick. I mean, they lost to Texas State in a blowout, and it was like, well, there goes that. You're already kind of done. And then to drop some of the games that they lost early in the conference season to teams that they shouldn't have lost to, like to lose to Rice and to lose to Tulsa. I think people forget because in college football more than anything else in life, there's a huge recency bias, I think, because they finished the season strong. People came away feeling pretty good about it. If the year played out in reverse, it would have been devastating. But, at the end of the day, it's still the same record. And it's great for the people that they feel good about it, but I do think in the big picture, it's hugely disappointing from what they thought they could be. And so, it was not us as the media driving the narrative that they could be a playoff team. That was them. They're the ones who sort of pushed that agenda from the start and really had that level of confidence. And based on what they had returning and kind of how the team shaped up, it might have been justified. But Traylor has put a lot of it on himself. He said that they weren't a very well coached team a lot of the time last year, and that mirrors some of the criticism that myself and people watching and the fans laid out at that time. So I think that it's been interesting to see that they've sort of changed the way they operate in the spring, or at least they say so, where a little bit more focus on discipline was the big talking point again and again, where if you are, a little bit late, you're going to be running. And if your shoes aren't lined up in your locker room, you're going to be running. And it's just like they've put all the focus on these details that Coach Traylor said usually in the past, he sort of delegated all that and let the assistants handle it. And there was a level of, well, if we're mean to this guy, is he going to transfer? And so do we have to be a little bit nicer? And I think they probably let some stuff slide. And I don't know how directly that translates to the field, but that's sort of the going narrative is we're just they say they want to tighten everything up. We're going to do this totally different from how we've done it in the past. And so to hear them talk about it in that way, I think is really interesting, and it'll just remain to be seen how it translates. But even this year, they were doing warm-ups different. Like they usually, for every year that I've been here, they've kind of had their stretch lines be their stretch lines, and now they did it in 3 groups because they think it's more efficient to have them like skills. I forget, there's 3 categories. It's like, the big guys, the skill players, and the in-betweens, hybrids, I think they called it, or whatever, because they, different body types need different warm-ups. And so they've just sort of gone back to the ground floor and reevaluated how they do a lot of different things that I think Coach Traylor will tell you he didn't have a hand in all that stuff the way that he wants to. He was just kind of focused on different things or fundraising or NIL or whatever. And now he's thinking we're going to go back to basics and we're going to look at this from the ground up. And so with that mentality, it'll really come down to how fast they start, because every year Traylor's been here, they have talked about some of the struggles early in the season and then sort of getting it together as the year goes on. They haven't always had the best non-conference record, and some of that's based on opponent, but it was just clear anecdotally and visually that their level of play was higher as the year went on. So I think that's what they're going to be looking for in the fall, to come out of the gate stronger than they have in the past. And if they want to hit that playoff goal, then that's essential. You can't really afford to drop any games, but I don't want to put that on them yet. It remains to be seen if they set the bar that high, because they'll probably be 4th or 5th projected in the conference behind some of these programs we talked about, like your Memphis and your Tulane, and even like your Army and Navy, given the success that they've had the last couple of years. So the expectations will not be as high for UTSA this year, but maybe that's their opportunity to surprise some people. I think this should be a really good team.
That kind of surprises me, because last year, if it was, hey, we think we can get that playoff spot, when you look at the return of production going into last season, there's 14 teams in the AAC. They were middle of the pack there in just their own conference, let alone in the whole grand scheme of FBS. And then this year, they're, I think, top 3-ish in returning production in the AAC, and they've got a lot more guys returning than they did last year. So I would think, they're poised, like you said, to have that breakout. Maybe you don't want to put it on there, but I'm going to put it on there. I'm expecting big things out of UTSA here in 2025.
Yeah, I know. I mean, in the conference preseason poll last year, I want to say they were picked 2nd, something like that. And this year, I really do think it'll be 4th or 5th, if that. I just think kind of based on the bottom line and the way things played out, they're going to have to fight a little bit harder to get that respect this year. But absolutely. Yeah. I wouldn't be surprised if they exceeded that expectation. And then it just comes down to how good everybody else is. I don't really know. I haven't, done all my homework in May on how good, Tulane and Memphis are going to be this year, and whether USF is ready to finally make that jump that it seems like they're always poised to make, and whether Army and Navy are still going to be as formidable as they were last year, or if that was kind of an outlier situation. So, yeah, I think it's hard to say at this point, but just looking at the UTSA part, I think that they have every reason to be more confident, and I just wonder how they'll choose to message it, because I think they don't want to make the same mistake twice in a row. And they didn't. I mean, we didn't rake them over the coals or whatever. Like, oh, you said you'd be this, and now you're this. Like, I think they're probably still at a young enough stage in their career, and the media around the program is such a way that, we certainly asked, hey, you said this. How do you reframe expectations and things like that? That probably got under their skin, but I don't think that they got made fun of the way they could have for setting such high goals and not living up to them. So. We'll see how they choose to message it this time around. I imagine that they will not put the same thing out in front of them for the 2nd year in a row, but it'll be really interesting. We'll know on media day. They usually, Jeff Traylor in particular, he's usually got some hashtag or some motto or something that, like, he knows what he wants the narrative to be coming into the year. And I didn't get the sense in the spring that they had that all the way figured out, aside from knowing that they wanted to be more disciplined. But by the time media day rolls around, I won't be surprised if they have a shirt with some motto on it, and that's what we'll be writing about. So we'll see how they choose to approach the year from the narrative side.
Well, Greg, we've covered a lot of ground today, but is there anything else you want to share or think that we should know about this 2025 UTSA Roadrunners football team?
I really don't think so. You guys are super comprehensive. I admire the way you guys approach this. It's like we cover just about everything, even special teams, which I'm so uncomfortable with at this time of the year. So I'm glad you didn't ask me who the punt returner is going to be or whatever. I couldn't tell you. But this is as comprehensive of a breakdown as you're going to find anywhere. So I think we covered just about everything.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Greg, for the kind words. And thank you for taking some time out of your day to spend with us and share your knowledge. We greatly appreciate it.
Of course, let's do it again next year, if not sooner.
Let's roll it back.
If you're watching us on YouTube, please hit that like and subscribe button. If you're listening in podcast form, please rate and review on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. Thank you all for your support. And until the next time, we are the G5 Hive.